Before we get into names, timelines, or why the internet is suddenly connecting dots that nobody wanted to talk about before, I need you to understand something clearly. This video is not about saying Jay-Z or Beyoncé committed crimes. It's about something way more uncomfortable than that. It's about power. It's about proximity. And it's about why certain people in the music industry have always been treated as untouchable. Because if you've been paying attention, you'll notice this conversation didn't start with Netflix. It didn't start with lawsuits. It didn't start with social media outrage. This conversation started years ago, quietly, and one of the few people who never stopped poking at it was 50 Cent. And now that Diddy's name is finally being examined publicly, people are going back and realizing something wild. 50 Cent has been saying this kind of stuff for over a decade. Not loudly, not recklessly, but consistently. And suddenly, people are listening. So let's slow this down and unpack why Jay-Z and Beyoncé keep coming up every time Diddy's name does, and why 50 Cent keeps being at the center of that conversation. Because this isn't random. For years, Diddy and Jay-Z existed as parallel forces in hip-hop. Different lanes, same altitude. One dominated nightlife, fashion, and celebrity culture. The other mastered ownership, partnerships, and corporate alignment. They weren't enemies. They weren't best friends. They were something more dangerous than either. They were equals. And when you're an equal at that level, you move in the same rooms. You attend the same events. You influence the same decision makers. You benefit from the same system. That doesn't mean wrongdoing, but it does mean insulation. 50 Cent has talked about this exact thing repeatedly. He said the industry isn't just about talent. It's about who can control narratives, who can shape perception, and who gets protected when things get uncomfortable. That's been his argument for years. Back when people laughed it off, they said 50 was just trolling, just bitter, just trying to stay relevant. But now that Diddy is no longer shielded by silence, people are re-examining those old comments differently. Because now the question isn't, why did 50 say this? It's, why did nobody listen? 50 has openly mocked Diddy's public persona for years. He's questioned the way Diddy was celebrated while rumors followed him everywhere. He's hinted that the industry looked the other way for too long. And every time he did, people said he was exaggerating. Until he wasn't. Now here's where Jay-Z enters the picture. Jay-Z has always been the opposite of loud controversy. Where Diddy was flashy, Jay-Z was calculated. Where Diddy embraced chaos, Jay-Z mastered distance. And 50 has pointed that out too. Not accusing him of anything, but highlighting how strategically Jay-Z moves. How rarely he's caught off guard. How rarely his name sticks to scandals. That's not luck, that's leverage. And when you talk about leverage, you have to talk about Beyoncé. Because Beyoncé isn't just an artist, she's a cultural force. Her image is pristine. Her brand is carefully curated. Her presence elevates everything around her. And that matters when you're talking about public perception. 50 has hinted, and this is important, that power in the industry isn't always about threats or force. Sometimes it's about symbolism. Sometimes it's about who people are afraid to question. And Beyoncé sits at the very top of that symbolic ladder. So when people online say connection, they're not saying Beyoncé did something illegal. They're saying her image, her brand, and her influence act as a shield around the ecosystem she's part of. That ecosystem includes Jay-Z. And Jay-Z's ecosystem has overlapped with Diddy's for decades. Again, that's not a crime. That's proximity. But proximity matters when a system starts collapsing. Because when one pillar falls, people naturally ask whether the others were built on the same foundation. That's what's happening now. The Diddy documentary didn't just expose allegations. It exposed how long those allegations circulated without consequence. It exposed how certain people remained celebrated while questions stayed buried. And 50 Cent leaned into that moment, not by accusing Jay-Z or Beyoncé directly, but by reminding people that power doesn't operate in isolation. He said in interviews that nobody at that level moves alone, that decisions are collective, that influence is shared. Those statements suddenly feel heavier now. And here's the part a lot of people miss. 50 Cent doesn't need to prove anything. He doesn't need documents. He doesn't need court cases. His role has always been to force discomfort. He asks questions others avoid. He pokes narratives others protect. And he does it in a way that makes people react emotionally, which tells you where the pressure points are. Look at how quickly people shut down any conversation involving Jay-Z or Beyoncé. Look at how defensive fans get. Look at how the industry closes ranks. That reaction alone tells you how powerful those names are. And power always attracts scrutiny eventually. Now let's talk about why this moment feels different from past cycles. Because in the past, artists stayed quiet, NDAs worked, careers depended on silence. But now, the internet doesn't forget. Clips resurface. Old interviews get re-examined. People connect dots whether they should or not. And once a conversation starts, it doesn't stop. That's what 50 understands better than almost anyone. He knows that once people start questioning systems instead of individuals, things shift. That's why he keeps framing this as an industry issue, not a personal attack. That's why he talks about gatekeeping, influence, and leverage instead of specific crimes. Because systems are harder to defend than people. And systems don't get sympathy. So when people say, 50 is exposing Jay-Z and Beyoncé, what they really mean is this. He's exposing how power protects itself. He's exposing how certain figures are elevated beyond critique. He's exposing how narratives are shaped, not necessarily through lies, but through omission. And that makes people uncomfortable, especially when the figures involved represent success, excellence, and aspiration. Nobody wants to believe their icons are part of flawed systems. But systems don't collapse unless people question them. And that's the real reason this conversation keeps resurfacing. Not because of proof, not because of crimes, but because silence is no longer guaranteed. So where does this leave Jay-Z and Beyoncé? It leaves them where they've always been. Powerful, influential, and under intense public scrutiny, whether they asked for it or not. And where does it leave 50 Cent? Exactly where he wants to be, at the center of the conversation. Not making accusations, but refusing to let people look away. And that's the part nobody can deny. Here's something most people still aren't fully clocking yet. 50 Cent isn't trying to convince you of anything specific. He's not asking you to believe a crime happened. He's not presenting a smoking gun. What he's doing is way more disruptive than that. He's forcing people to reevaluate certainty. Because for years, the music industry ran on an unspoken agreement. Some people are allowed to be complicated, and some people are allowed to be questioned. Those categories rarely overlap. Diddy lived in the complicated but celebrated box for a long time. Jay-Z and Beyoncé live in the above questioning box. And what 50 is doing, intentionally or not, is dragging those boxes closer together, not collapsing them, not equating them, just making the distance between them feel smaller. And once that distance shrinks, the audience starts asking questions the industry never wanted to answer. Here's another angle that doesn't get talked about enough: timing. 50 Cent didn't suddenly wake up and decide to talk about Diddy, Jay-Z, or Beyoncé. He waited years, decades even, and that patience matters. People forget that 50 has been inside the industry long enough to understand when speaking is pointless, when silence is safer, when the cost of honesty outweighs the benefit. So why now? Because the industry is weaker than it's ever been. Streaming flattened power. Social media killed gatekeeping. Artists no longer need labels the way they used to. Fans don't rely on press releases. They rely on clips, leaks, and long-form breakdowns. The old system still exists, but it doesn't control the narrative the way it once did. And that's why this moment feels different. Back in the 2000s, questioning Jay-Z publicly would get you blackballed. Questioning Beyoncé would get you erased socially. Questioning Diddy would get you laughed off as bitter. Today, it gets clicks. That shift is massive. And 50 understands that better than almost anyone because he's lived through both eras. Another uncomfortable truth: proximity doesn't mean participation, but it does mean responsibility, at least in the public eye. When people say Jay-Z and Beyoncé are connected to Diddy, they're not saying they did the same things. They're saying they shared platforms, visibility, and industry benefits while rumors circulated. And that's where public perception starts to change. Because fans don't just ask, "What did you do?" anymore. They ask, "What did you allow?" And "What did you ignore?" Those questions aren't fair, but they're real. And once they're out there, they don't go away. 50 has leaned into this shift by positioning himself as someone who doesn't need approval anymore. He doesn't need radio play. He doesn't need label relationships. He doesn't need award shows. That freedom is dangerous because people who don't need anything can say anything. And that's why his words hit harder now than they did 10 years ago. So the real question isn't, what are they hiding? It's, why are we only comfortable asking these questions now? Because the industry didn't change overnight. The silence just broke. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you see this as necessary scrutiny? Do you think 50 pushes too far? Or do you think this is what happens when power finally gets examined? Because this conversation isn't ending. It's just getting louder. Anyway, this concludes today's video. Be sure to subscribe to LoafTube for future celebrity videos, and turn on that post notification bell so you don't miss out on any future uploads. Until then, see you in the next one.